Little boy helps a homeless woman. The next day, his life changes forever. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when 8-year-old Leo walked home from school, kicking pebbles along the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the trees were a mix of amber and red, falling around him in slow, lazy spirals. Leo enjoyed these walks, often dreaming up imaginary stories, each pebble a piece of a fantasy kingdom he ruled in his mind. But today, something caught his eye that would change his life forever. A figure, wrapped in a ragged old coat, sitting by the corner bakery, shivering slightly as she clutched a battered coffee cup. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next fantastic stories. The woman was quiet, her eyes focused on the ground. Her hair was tangled, and her face bore a weariness that seemed older than time. Despite her disheveled appearance, something about her drew Leo closer. He felt a strange sadness mixed with curiosity. She didn't call out or ask for money like others he'd seen before. She simply sat there, as if she were just a part of the background, unnoticed by the world. Leo's heart ached as he wondered what had brought her here. Without thinking much about it, Leo dug into his backpack, pulling out the lunch his mom had packed earlier that morning. The sandwich was half-eaten, but he knew he could go without it. He walked up to the woman and extended his small hand, offering her the sandwich. She looked up, startled, her weary eyes locking onto his with a surprised intensity. Leo could feel the weight of her gaze, as if she were trying to understand why he was being kind to her. "Here," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "You can have it." I don't need it." She hesitated, then took the sandwich with trembling hands, her face softening as a small, almost invisible smile formed on her lips. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice a whisper as well, filled with gratitude and something deeper, something Leo couldn't quite identify. She took a small bite, and as she did, Leo noticed a hint of grace in her movements, a faint trace of something refined and polished. Leo felt a strange connection to her, an invisible thread tying them together in this moment. "What's your name?" he asked, his young voice breaking the silence. She paused, looking down at the sandwich, as though contemplating whether to answer. After a moment, she replied, "My name is Helena." There was something in her tone, a lingering sadness, perhaps even regret, that hung in the air between them. Leo, in his innocent heart, sensed that she had a story, one buried deep beneath her worn coat and tired eyes. They spoke only a little more before Leo's mother called him from down the street. He waved goodbye to Helena, promising he'd see her around. As he walked away, he felt a strange mix of emotions, sorrow, curiosity, and a touch of hope. Helena watched him leave, a faint glimmer in her eyes as she held the sandwich close, as if it were a treasure. Little did Leo know, this small act of kindness would set in motion a series of events that would transform both their lives. That evening, Leo mentioned Helena to his mother, his young mind unable to let go of the encounter. His mother listened patiently, smiling as he described the mysterious lady by the bakery. She told him it was kind of him to share his lunch, but she also warned him to be careful, as he didn't know anything about this stranger. Still, Leo couldn't shake the feeling that there was something special about her. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he'd see her again. The next day, he looked for Helena as he passed by the bakery, his heart hopeful. She was there, sitting on the same spot, her head slightly bowed as she stared at her hands. This time, he brought her a small bag of cookies, and her face lit up with a look of gratitude that made his heart swell. As they shared another quiet conversation, Leo noticed a sadness in her eyes that seemed to deepen each time they spoke. It was as if she carried an invisible weight, one that grew heavier with each passing day. Leo didn't know it then, but Helena had once lived a life that was vastly different from the one she now led on the streets. She was a woman with a hidden past, one that was filled with both privilege and heartache. The boy had unknowingly touched something within her, a spark of hope buried beneath years of regret and loss. And as they spoke, day after day, the connection between them grew, an unlikely bond that neither of them fully understood. What Leo could not yet grasp was that Helena's story, her fall from grace, and the mysterious circumstances that had led her to this place would soon unravel before him, pulling him into a journey far beyond anything he could have imagined. And as he left her side each day, she watched him with a look that grew more determined, a spark rekindling in her once dull eyes. Each day after school, Leo made it a habit to stop by the bakery corner, where Helena sat quietly with her coffee cup. His mother had noticed his leftover lunchboxes and questioned him about it, and he had simply replied, "There's a friend who needs it more than I do." Her curiosity was piqued, but she trusted her son's kind heart, letting him go about his new routine. And so, Leo continued to meet Helena, sharing his lunches, small treats, and sometimes even his own stories from school. At first, Helena was guarded, speaking only in short replies, nodding or offering a faint smile when he shared his stories. But slowly, Leo's cheerful innocence began to wear down her defenses. She began sharing small details about herself, little hints about her life before the streets, veiled in careful words. "I used to go to places much like the one you go to every day," she once told him with a sad smile, as he described his classroom to her. "They taught me all sorts of things there, things I thought I would always have." These glimpses fascinated Leo, filling his young mind with images of a life far removed from the one Helena lived now. He couldn't imagine her as anything but the kind woman in the worn coat who accepted his sandwiches with gratitude. But her words lingered, and he wondered what had happened to bring her here. As he handed her a warm cup of cocoa one chilly afternoon, he ventured, "Did you have a nice house before, Miss Helena?" She looked down at the cup, her eyes clouding over as though replaying scenes of a life long lost. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I had a big house. A place that felt safe, warm. But sometimes, things happen that you can't control." Her voice trailed off, as though trapped in a memory too painful to continue. Leo wanted to ask more, but sensing her sadness, he changed the subject, telling her about his favorite action hero instead, trying to lift her spirits. Helena's soft laughter, rare and fleeting, was his reward, and he smiled widely at the sound. Their friendship grew in these quiet moments, an unspoken bond forming between the boy and the mysterious woman. Leo began to look forward to their talks, carrying little treasures in his pockets, a drawing he'd made, a small toy he no longer used, an apple from his lunch, to give to Helena, hoping to bring a little brightness to her days. Helena's smile grew more genuine, her laughter a bit easier, and sometimes her eyes held a glint of warmth, a light Leo had not seen before. One afternoon, as they sat together, Helena asked him a question that took him by surprise. "Why are you so kind to me, Leo? You don't know me, and yet you come every day." Her voice was filled with genuine wonder, a hint of vulnerability slipping through her usually guarded tone. Leo shrugged, his young face thoughtful. "You're my friend, Miss Helena. My mom always says friends help each other when they need it, and I think you need it." Helena's eyes misted over, and for a moment, Leo thought she might cry. But instead, she patted his shoulder gently, a gesture that felt both motherly and friendly. "You have a very kind heart, Leo," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And you're right. I do need a friend." There was a long silence as they sat together, and in that quiet moment, a part of Helena's heart, one she had thought long buried, seemed to awaken. She hadn't felt this kind of warmth in years. Over the next few weeks, Helena began to open up little by little, as if piece by piece, she was showing Leo parts of her past. She told him about the parties she used to attend, the grand halls filled with laughter and music, the expensive clothes she had once worn. Leo listened, his eyes wide with fascination, though he didn't fully grasp the luxury of her former life. To him, Helena's stories were like fairy tales, glimpses of a world he'd only seen in books and movies. But despite the spark in her voice as she recounted these memories, there was always a shadow that crept in, a sadness that darkened her eyes when she talked about her past. "But that was all before," she would say, leaving her sentence unfinished, as though the rest of her story were locked away behind a door she couldn't open. Leo sensed there was more to her story, a missing piece that explained why she was here, on the streets, alone. One late afternoon, after Leo handed her a warm blanket he'd saved his allowance to buy, she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Leo," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "one day, you might understand that life doesn't always turn out the way we plan. People make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes can change everything." He looked up at her, his young face filled with earnestness. "But maybe things will get better for you, Miss Helena. Maybe one day you'll have that big house again. In the days that followed, Leo continued his visits with Helena, each one filled with stories that revealed more of her life, though they always seemed to end just before the heart of her story could emerge. She would trail off mid-sentence or shift the conversation back to Leo's life, eager to hear about his dreams and plans. Despite the mystery that surrounded her, Leo sensed that Helena carried a sadness too heavy for words. Still, he felt he was slowly piecing together fragments of her past, as if he was solving a complex puzzle hidden within her stories. One chilly afternoon, Leo brought Helena a small, handmade card he'd created himself. It was a simple thing, drawn with markers and decorated with his childlike scribbles, but it made Helena's eyes shine with gratitude. "Thank you, Leo," she said softly, her fingers tracing the bright colors. "It's been so long since anyone's made something for me." Her voice wavered slightly, betraying a hint of emotion she tried to hide. She looked up, meeting his eyes. "You remind me of someone I once knew, a long time ago." Intrigued, Leo leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Who, Miss Helena?" he asked, his eyes wide. Helena looked away, her expression distant as though lost in a memory. "Someone who used to believe in me," she murmured, her voice filled with a bittersweet tone. She smiled softly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "They were the only person who thought I could be more than I was." Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head, as if shaking away the memory. "What happened?" Leo pressed gently, sensing that this memory was important. Helena looked down, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the card. I let them down," she said finally, her voice so quiet he almost couldn't hear. "I was given so much, but I took it for granted. I made choices that led me here." She gestured around them, to the corner where she sat each day, to the streets that had become her life. Leo didn't understand everything she was saying, but he could feel the sadness in her words. "But Miss Helena," he said earnestly, "you're a good person. I know it. You're my friend, and you're nice to me." She looked at him, a mix of surprise and affection in her eyes. "Thank you, Leo," she said softly. "Sometimes I forget what it feels like to be seen as good." For a moment, the shadows seemed to lift from her face, replaced by a warmth that made her look almost as she might have in her past life. As the weeks went by, Helena grew a bit more open, sharing small pieces of her story in moments of quiet honesty. She told him about her love for books, especially those with stories of adventure and transformation, stories where characters found redemption even in the darkest of times. "I used to dream about becoming a writer," she confessed one day, her voice wistful. "I thought maybe, one day, I'd write my own story. One where I could be the hero, instead of the villain." Leo tilted his head, puzzled. "But you're not a villain, Miss Helena," he insisted, his voice filled with conviction. "You're nice, and you make me happy. Isn't that what good people do?" Helena chuckled, a soft, sad laugh that held years of regret. "Maybe you're right, Leo," she said quietly. "But sometimes, even good people make mistakes that they can't fix. And when that happens, they have to live with those choices every day." Despite her words, Leo couldn't shake the feeling that Helena's past was more complex than she let on. Each day, she seemed to carry a burden he couldn't see, and he noticed her glancing around warily, as if afraid someone might recognize her. Leo wanted to ask her more, but he sensed that her story was locked behind walls she wasn't ready to break. Instead, he listened, letting her share whatever she felt comfortable revealing, hoping that one day she'd trust him with the full truth. One afternoon, after a particularly chilly night, Leo noticed that Helena's coat was even more tattered than usual. Without thinking twice, he asked his mother if he could take one of his father's old jackets, explaining that he had a friend who needed it. His mother, understanding his kindness, agreed, though she warned him to be cautious. Leo returned to the bakery corner with the jacket, and when he offered it to Helena, her eyes filled with tears she couldn't hide. "Why do you do this for me, Leo?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief and wonder. "I don't deserve this kindness." But Leo only smiled, his youthful innocence shining through. "Because you're my friend," he said simply, "and friends help each other." Helena accepted the jacket, pulling it close as though it were a shield against the cold. In that moment, Leo felt he had given her something more than warmth, he had given her a reminder of her own worth, buried though it was beneath years of regret. Over time, the people around the neighborhood began to notice Helena's presence, and though most ignored her, some began to whisper. Leo heard snippets, comments about that woman on the corner, spoken in hushed tones with disapproving glances. He didn't understand why people spoke about her that way, but he felt a growing protectiveness toward his friend. He knew there was more to Helena than what people saw, and he was determined to show her that someone believed in her, no matter what had happened before. Yet even as he continued to bring her small gifts and share his stories, Leo couldn't shake the feeling that something about Helena's life before her time on the streets held a secret, a mystery that might change everything. As the weeks continued to pass, Leo's friendship with Helena deepened. Despite the cold winds and the increasing whispers from the neighbors, Leo remained her faithful companion, always offering her small tokens of kindness and company. But with each passing day, he became more aware of the shadows in her gaze, the way her eyes would drift to the ground whenever someone unfamiliar passed by. Helena carried herself with a quiet grace, but there was an unmistakable weight on her shoulders, as though she were constantly haunted by something invisible yet unbearably heavy. One afternoon, as Leo approached her usual spot by the bakery, he noticed Helena staring into the distance, her face frozen with an expression he couldn't quite place, fear, perhaps, or regret. When he greeted her, she started, as though waking from a nightmare, and quickly forced a smile. But Leo had grown attuned to her moods. He could see the worry in her eyes and the way her hands shook slightly as she took the sandwich he offered. "Are you okay, Miss Helena?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Helena hesitated, her gaze softening as she looked at the boy who had shown her so much kindness. For a brief moment, it seemed as though she might finally share the truth that lay hidden beneath her guarded exterior. But instead, she simply nodded, her expression wistful. "I'm fine, Leo," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Just thinking about the past." Leo sat down beside her, sensing that today was one of those rare days when she might reveal something new. "Do you ever think about going back?" he asked innocently. "To where you came from, I mean." Helena's face grew distant, her gaze fixed on something far away. "Sometimes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But there are things I did that, well, they can't be undone. There are places I can't return to." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Leo's young mind tried to make sense of them, piecing together the fragments of her story that she had let slip. He didn't understand everything, but he knew that Helena had once been someone important, someone who had fallen from a place of wealth and comfort into the shadows where she now lived. He sensed that her journey to the streets hadn't been a simple accident but rather the result of choices that still haunted her. Later that night, Leo told his mother about his latest conversation with Helena, his curiosity spilling over into their usual evening chat. His mother listened quietly, her expression growing more concerned as she heard about Helena's troubled words. She had let Leo help the mysterious woman out of trust in his kindness, but now a sense of worry began to take root in her heart. She wondered who Helena truly was, what past might be lurking behind her polite smiles and soft laughter. "I just don't understand, Mom," Leo said, his brows furrowing in frustration. "She's a nice person. I know it. But it's like there's something she's hiding, something that keeps her from being happy." His mother nodded thoughtfully, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, Leo, people carry things from their past that make it hard for them to find peace," she explained gently. "And sometimes, no matter how much kindness we show them, those burdens are too heavy for them to let go of." Leo pondered her words, feeling a mix of sadness and confusion. He didn't understand why someone like Helena, who had shown him nothing but kindness, would be burdened by something that made her feel so unworthy of happiness. But he knew one thing for sure: no matter what her past held, he wanted to help her, to show her that she was more than her mistakes. The next day, he resolved to try and lift her spirits, hoping that his friendship could chip away at the shadows that clung to her. The following afternoon, Leo approached her with a small, carefully wrapped box. Inside was a bracelet he had saved up to buy, a simple piece, with a delicate silver charm in the shape of a heart. He handed it to her with a shy smile, explaining that he thought she might like something to remind her that she wasn't alone. Helena looked down at the bracelet, her face softening as tears filled her eyes. She took it with trembling hands, a mixture of surprise and gratitude shining in her gaze. Leo. I don't know what to say, she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. I haven't been given a gift in years. She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, admiring its simple beauty. For a brief moment, her face lit up with something almost like joy, a glimpse of the woman she had once been. But just as quickly, her expression darkened, and she looked away, her smile fading. Thank you, she whispered. I don't deserve it, but thank you. Leo frowned, confusion evident on his young face. Why do you keep saying that, Miss Helena? He asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Why don't you think you deserve nice things? You're a good person, and good people deserve to be happy. Helena looked at him, her gaze filled with a sadness that seemed endless. Oh, Leo, she sighed, her voice barely a whisper. Sometimes, people make choices that they can never take back. And those choices, they leave scars that no amount of kindness can heal. The words haunted Leo, lingering in his mind long after they'd parted ways for the evening. He wondered what kind of choices Helena had made that could make her feel so unworthy, so burdened by guilt. The puzzle pieces were there, scattered across her stories, but he felt as though he were missing the final, crucial piece that would reveal the whole picture. Yet, even as he wrestled with these questions, he felt his bond with Helena growing stronger, a bond that seemed to transcend her hidden past. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Leo made a promise to himself. He would keep helping Helena, keep showing her that she was more than her past mistakes. He didn't know how, but he believed, in the way that only a child could, that his friendship could be the key to freeing her from whatever darkness held her captive. The days grew colder, and winter's edge crept into the air, painting the streets with frost. Leo continued his visits with Helena, even as his mother's concern grew. She saw how invested her son had become in this mysterious woman, but something about Helena's past, pieced together through Leo's innocent retellings, unsettled her. She was proud of her son's generosity, yet worried about what lay hidden behind Helena's vague stories and quiet sadness. Despite her concerns, she chose not to interfere, allowing Leo to follow his heart. One afternoon, as Leo approached Helena's usual spot near the bakery, he noticed her absence for the first time. Her spot, usually marked by a faintly worn patch of concrete and the hint of her presence, was empty. A strange worry twisted in his chest as he looked around, wondering where she might have gone. He lingered by the bakery for a while, watching people pass by, hoping to catch a glimpse of her familiar figure. But Helena was nowhere to be seen. As he began to walk back home, his mind swirled with concern. Had something happened to her? Had she decided to leave without saying goodbye? The thought saddened him, but it was her safety that worried him most. He remembered how fragile she looked, how the winter chill seemed to sink into her very bones. The streets weren't kind to those without shelter, and he feared for her well-being as the nights grew colder. The next day, he returned to the bakery, hoping she would be there, but once again, her spot was empty. Days passed, each one stretching his worry further, until finally, after nearly a week, he spotted her from a distance. She was sitting in her usual place, wrapped in an old coat with a scarf pulled tight around her face, her shoulders hunched against the cold. Leo's heart leapt with relief, and he ran over, clutching a thermos of warm soup he had brought from home. Miss Helena! I was so worried, he exclaimed, his voice filled with a mixture of joy and concern. She looked up, startled by his sudden presence, and he saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes. Oh, Leo, she murmured, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to make you worry. Her gaze dropped to the ground, as though avoiding his eyes. I just needed some time to think. Leo handed her the thermos, watching as she took it with trembling hands, her expression softening with gratitude. Are you okay? He asked, his voice gentle. Helena nodded, though her face bore signs of exhaustion and perhaps something deeper, an inner turmoil that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing day. Thanks to you, she replied softly, taking a sip of the warm soup. He noticed the shadows under her eyes, the weariness that seemed to cling to her like a second skin. Despite her gratitude, she seemed even more distant, as though something in her had retreated even further away. Leo sensed her sadness but didn't know how to reach it, how to break through the walls she had built around herself. He wanted to ask why she had disappeared, what troubled her so deeply, but he feared pushing her too far. Helena seemed to sense his hesitation, and after a long silence, she spoke, her voice filled with a kind of resignation. "Leo, there are things in my past, mistakes I made, things I can't take back. They're the reason I'm here, the reason I can't go back to who I was." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I thought, maybe it was best if I stayed away. I didn't want to burden you with my troubles." Leo frowned, shaking his head firmly. "But you're not a burden, Miss Helena. You're my friend, and I want to help you." His words were simple, but there was a determination in his voice that made her look up, a flicker of something, hope, perhaps, crossing her face. "Thank you, Leo," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve your kindness, but, thank you." That day, they talked as they always did, though there was a new heaviness in Helena's voice, a sense that something had shifted. As they spoke, Leo shared stories of his family, his school, his dreams. He hoped his words might bring her a moment of joy, a reminder that there was light beyond the shadows that haunted her. Helena listened intently, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she listened to his stories, though her eyes held a sadness that even his cheerful tales couldn't erase. As the evening grew darker, Helena reached out, taking Leo's hand in hers. Her grip was firm yet gentle, and for the first time, he saw her truly look at him, as though she were memorizing his face. "You're a special boy, Leo," she said softly. "I don't know what I did to deserve meeting you, but you've given me something I thought I'd lost." She paused, her gaze distant. "You've given me hope." Leo felt a warmth spread through him, a sense that his friendship had truly made a difference. But as they said their goodbyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that Helena was preparing herself for something final, something he couldn't understand. Winter deepened, blanketing the town in an icy chill that crept into every corner. Despite the cold, Leo's visits to Helena never wavered. He would arrive each afternoon, bundled in layers, with something warm for her to eat or drink, always met by her gentle, grateful smile. Yet he noticed that with each day, she seemed more withdrawn, her gaze lingering on the street as though she were waiting for something, or someone, to appear. Her stories grew shorter, punctuated by long silences, and her expressions of thanks held a heaviness he hadn't seen before. One day, as he arrived, he found Helena in conversation with a man he didn't recognize. The stranger wore a long coat, his face shadowed by a hat that obscured his features. Leo's heart pounded as he watched them from a distance, noting the tension in Helena's posture, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The man's voice was low, but his tone seemed sharp, almost threatening. Leo hesitated, torn between approaching and letting them finish their conversation, but something about the man's presence filled him with unease. As he took a step forward, the man abruptly turned and walked away, his footsteps fading quickly into the distance. Helena watched him leave, her shoulders slumping, a defeated expression crossing her face. She looked drained, as though that brief encounter had taken a toll on her, and when she turned and saw Leo standing there, her expression shifted, softening into a sad smile. She tried to wave away his concern, but he couldn't ignore the tension that still lingered in her eyes. "Who was that?" he asked cautiously, his gaze flicking to the street where the man had disappeared. Helena hesitated, looking down at her hands. "Just someone from my past," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Leo sensed that she didn't want to talk about it, so he didn't press further, though his curiosity burned. Instead, he handed her the cup of soup he'd brought, hoping the warmth would bring her comfort, if only for a moment. They sat together in silence, the weight of her past hanging heavily between them. Finally, Helena broke the silence, her gaze distant. "Leo, sometimes life takes us down paths we never expected," she began softly. "Paths we would give anything to turn away from. But once you've walked too far, it's hard to go back." Her words were filled with a sorrow that Leo didn't fully understand, but he listened intently, sensing the depth of her pain. "Is that why you're here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because of something you can't go back from?" Helena nodded slowly, her eyes misting over. "I made mistakes," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I had everything: comfort, security, people who cared about me. But I let my pride and greed get in the way, and before I knew it, everything slipped through my fingers." Leo's eyes widened, and he wanted to ask more, but he held back, sensing that she was finally opening a door she had kept closed for a long time. There were people who trusted me, she continued, her gaze fixed on some point in the distance. People I loved, but I let them down. I thought I could fix things, that I could handle everything on my own, but in the end, I lost it all. A heavy silence fell between them, and Leo tried to imagine the life she had described, a life of security, filled with people who cared. The image of Helena in such a life felt almost surreal, a sharp contrast to the woman who now sat beside him, worn down by years of regret and survival. "Do you think you could ever get it back?" he asked carefully, his young voice filled with hope. Helena looked at him, a sad smile on her lips. "I don't know," she replied softly. "It's hard to rebuild when you're carrying so much guilt, so much shame. But you," she hesitated, her voice catching. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost, Leo. Your kindness, your friendship, it reminds me of who I used to be, who I wanted to be." Her words were filled with a quiet gratitude, a spark of hope that glimmered beneath the layers of regret. As dusk fell, Helena became even more reflective, her words tinged with a bittersweet nostalgia. She spoke of parties she once attended, grand halls filled with music and laughter, a lifestyle that felt like a distant dream. Leo listened, captivated, though he sensed a hollowness in her descriptions, as though the happiness she described had always been just out of reach. "But it was all an illusion," she murmured, her voice filled with sorrow. "None of it mattered in the end. I chased the wrong things, and I paid the price." Leo thought about her words long after they parted that evening. He couldn't shake the image of Helena as someone who had once been admired, loved, respected, someone who had fallen from grace. The mystery surrounding her deepened, each fragment of her story like a puzzle piece that almost fit, but not quite. And in his young heart, a quiet determination grew. He wanted to help her find a way back, to see her truly smile, free of the shadows that haunted her. Over the next few days, he tried to bring her small things he thought might bring her comfort, a fresh blanket, a pair of gloves he'd saved up for, small tokens of friendship. She accepted them with gratitude, though her eyes always held that same sadness, a regret too deep to be eased by material things. Leo noticed that she seemed even more guarded, as if her encounter with the mysterious man had reminded her of something she couldn't escape. One afternoon, as they sat in their usual spot, Leo noticed a newspaper on the ground nearby, its pages rustling in the breeze. On a whim, he picked it up, glancing over the headlines, hoping to find something interesting to share. But as his eyes scanned the page, a photograph caught his attention. A photo of a woman dressed elegantly, her hair swept back, standing beside a distinguished-looking man. His heart skipped a beat. The woman looked just like Helena, though younger and far more polished. He turned to her, the newspaper clutched tightly in his hands, his heart pounding. "Miss Helena, is this you?" he asked, his voice filled with shock. Helena's face paled as she looked at the photograph, her expression one of horror and resignation. Helena's face went white as she stared at the photograph in Leo's hands. She looked as though she'd seen a ghost, her hands trembling as she reached out, but then hesitated, pulling back as though even touching the newspaper would burn her. The familiar woman in the photograph was undeniably her, though younger, dressed in fine clothes, standing beside a man in an elegant suit. In the background was a grand building with sprawling gardens, a place that seemed worlds apart from the life she now lived. Leo's heart raced, his mind racing with questions he barely knew how to ask. "Miss Helena, was this you?" he asked softly, his voice trembling. He watched her carefully, unsure of how she would respond. She seemed trapped in a memory, her eyes locked on the image, the past she had worked so hard to leave behind suddenly thrust back into the open. For a moment, she looked away, shame flickering in her gaze, but then she straightened, her shoulders tense. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That was me, a long time ago." She sighed, her fingers tightening around the edges of her coat as though holding on for support. "The woman in that photograph, she was someone I don't recognize anymore. Someone I left behind because of choices, mistakes, that can never be undone." Her voice was filled with a bitterness that Leo hadn't heard before, an edge that spoke of deep, buried regret. Leo sat beside her in silence, sensing that this was a part of her life she had long hidden, a truth she had tried to bury beneath the weight of her new reality. "You were famous?" he asked hesitantly, his voice filled with awe. Helena let out a soft, humorless laugh. Famous, admired, envied, but for all the wrong reasons. People only saw what was on the surface. They had no idea who I really was, and I didn't know either. I thought I was invincible, that nothing could touch me. She paused, looking out into the distance as though lost in a memory she tried to forget. Back then, I had everything. A beautiful home, a successful career, people who respected me, or so I thought. But what I really had was an empty life built on lies. I was careless, selfish, and I hurt the people who mattered most to me. Her voice broke, and for the first time, Leo saw tears glistening in her eyes, a vulnerability she had never shown him before. Leo reached out, his small hand covering hers in a gesture of comfort. "Miss Helena, everyone makes mistakes," he said softly, his voice filled with compassion beyond his years. "You're not a bad person. You're my friend, and you've always been kind to me." Helena looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and sadness. "Thank you, Leo," she whispered. "But kindness doesn't erase what I did. I destroyed lives that trusted me." For the first time, Helena began to reveal fragments of her story, her voice filled with the weight of years of regret. She spoke of a business empire she had helped build, a company that thrived on wealth and power. She described how she had become wrapped up in the pursuit of success, ignoring the people who tried to warn her, pushing away anyone who questioned her choices. She admitted to manipulating others, taking risks that benefited herself at the expense of those who believed in her. One night, she confessed, everything came crashing down. "I made a choice that cost people their futures," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Investors, employees, families who relied on me to keep things honest. But I was blinded by ambition, by the thrill of power, and I didn't see the destruction I was causing." She clenched her fists, her gaze darkening. "When the truth came out, people lost everything. And I lost myself." Leo listened, his young mind struggling to comprehend the scale of her story, the layers of betrayal and ruin that had brought her to where she was now. He could see the pain in her eyes, the remorse that haunted her every word. "Is that why you're here?" he asked softly. Because of what happened?" She nodded, her gaze filled with sorrow. "When everything fell apart, I didn't just lose my wealth. I lost my identity, my purpose. I was left with nothing but my own mistakes." Her voice was heavy with grief as she continued, "I couldn't bear to face the people I'd hurt, so I left. I walked away from the life I'd built, from the ashes of my own choices. I thought maybe, out here, I could find a way to atone. But every day, I feel the weight of what I did. It's like a chain around my heart, one that I can never break." A silence fell between them, and Leo felt the enormity of her confessions settling around him. He didn't fully understand the complexities of her past, but he could feel the depth of her regret, the pain that had shaped her into the woman she was now. He squeezed her hand gently, his young heart filled with compassion. "Miss Helena, maybe you can't change the past, but you're not alone. I'm here, and I'll help you." Helena looked at him, her expression one of awe and gratitude. "Thank you, Leo," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given me more kindness than I deserve. And maybe it's time I stop running." She looked down at the newspaper, a hint of determination flickering in her eyes. The revelation of Helena's past lingered in Leo's mind long after he left her side that evening. He could hardly reconcile the woman he knew, the kind, gentle friend who accepted his sandwiches and stories, with the image of a once powerful businesswoman who had left a trail of broken lives behind. And yet, despite the weight of her past, Leo's feelings toward Helena didn't change. He still saw her as his friend, someone who had shown him nothing but kindness. If anything, her confession only strengthened his resolve to help her find peace. The next afternoon, as he approached her usual spot, he noticed a new intensity in Helena's expression. She sat upright, her gaze focused, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as though preparing herself for something daunting. Leo could sense the change, the way her body seemed more rigid, her eyes sharper, as if she were finally bracing herself to face the demons that had haunted her for so long. "Leo," she greeted him, her voice steadier than usual. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what you said yesterday." She looked at him with a seriousness that made him feel both proud and a little nervous. You're right. I can't keep running from my mistakes. I've been hiding for so long, pretending the past can't reach me. But the truth is, it's never left me. Her gaze drifted to the distant horizon, her face softening. It's time for me to confront what I did and find a way to make it right. Leo nodded, though he didn't fully understand what making it right would look like. He sensed it would be a long, difficult journey, one that would require Helena to dredge up memories she had worked hard to bury. I believe in you, Miss Helena, he said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. I know you're strong enough to face this. She smiled at his words, a small, hopeful smile that hinted at the woman she had once been, the woman who still lived somewhere deep within her. Over the next few days, Leo continued to visit her, and he could feel the shift in their conversations. Helena began to share more details of her past, slowly peeling back the layers of the life she had once lived. She described the grand offices she had worked in, the towering glass walls overlooking the city, the constant rush of people eager to please her, to win her approval. It felt like being at the top of the world, she admitted one afternoon, her voice tinged with both nostalgia and regret. But it was a world built on a foundation that couldn't last. She spoke of the deals she had made, the risks she had taken, and the people she had pushed aside in her relentless pursuit of success. Leo listened, his young heart feeling the weight of her words, the regret that colored every memory she shared. He saw glimpses of the ambitious woman she had once been, a woman who had climbed her way to the top only to realize, too late, that the price was too high. Yet beneath it all, he sensed her desire for redemption, her longing to make amends. One cold evening, as they sat together beneath the dim streetlights, Helena revealed the final, painful piece of her story. There was one person who believed in me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone who saw past the ambition, past the greed. They tried to warn me, tried to make me see what I was doing, but I didn't listen. Her hands trembled as she spoke, her gaze fixed on the ground. When everything fell apart, they were the one who suffered the most. I betrayed their trust, and I can never undo that. Leo felt a pang of sorrow for her, sensing the deep pain that memory brought her. Do they know where you are now? He asked softly. Helena shook her head, her expression filled with regret. No. I left without a word. I couldn't face them, not after what I'd done. I thought disappearing would be easier, that if they never saw me again, they might find a way to move on. But the truth is, I was running away because I was afraid. Leo thought carefully before he spoke, sensing the delicate nature of her emotions. Miss Helena, maybe they haven't moved on. Maybe they are waiting, hoping for a way to forgive you. His words were simple, innocent, yet they carried a weight that even Helena couldn't ignore. She looked at him, her gaze softening, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. I don't know if I deserve their forgiveness, Leo. I don't know if I can ever make up for what I did. You won't know unless you try, Leo replied gently, his voice filled with quiet determination. Sometimes, people just need to know that you're sorry, that you're willing to make things right. His words struck a chord with her, and she nodded slowly, as though absorbing the possibility that she might still have a chance at redemption. It was a chance she had denied herself for so long, yet here, in the presence of this young boy, she felt her courage returning, her resolve strengthening. As winter deepened, Leo and Helena devised a plan, a way for her to reach out, to begin the process of rebuilding the bridges she had once burned. She decided to contact a few people from her past, people who might still have connections to the person she had hurt the most. Each step was filled with hesitation, with doubt, but Leo's unwavering support gave her the strength to continue. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope, a feeling she had almost forgotten. One day, as they sat together in the cold, Helena confided, I don't know what will come of this, Leo. I don't know if they'll even want to hear from me. She looked down, her expression filled with a mixture of anxiety and resolve. But even if they turn me away, at least I'll know I tried. Leo squeezed her hand gently, his small fingers warm against hers. I'll be here with you, Miss Helena. No matter what happens, you'll always have a friend. Her heart swelled at his words, a profound gratitude filling her as she realized that this young boy had given her more than she could ever repay. In his innocence, his kindness, he had offered her a gift she hadn't dared hope for, a second chance, a way to begin again. And as they sat together, wrapped in the silence of the winter evening, Helena allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could finally find peace. With Leo's quiet encouragement, Helena took her first tentative steps toward reclaiming her past. It was as if Leo had unlocked a door she had bolted shut long ago, opening it just enough to let hope seep in. But with each step forward, Helena's mind was plagued by doubt and fear. Years of guilt and shame had woven themselves into her very being, and as she reached out to people from her former life, she often found herself holding her breath, waiting for rejection. One morning, with Leo by her side for support, Helena called an old friend, someone who had once been like family but whom she'd lost contact with after everything had fallen apart. Leo watched her closely, his heart pounding as she held the phone to her ear, her hand shaking. She hadn't spoken to this friend in years, and though Leo didn't fully understand the depth of her anxiety, he could see the fear and longing in her eyes as she waited for the phone to ring. When her friend finally answered, Helena's face went pale. She stammered a soft hello, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the delicate moment. The conversation was short, hesitant, but as Helena hung up, Leo noticed a faint smile pulling at the corners of her lips. She looked at him, a mixture of relief and disbelief in her eyes. They agreed to meet me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "After all these years, they want to see me." Leo grinned, his eyes shining with pride. "See? I told you they'd want to hear from you," he said, his voice filled with the innocent confidence that had fueled her courage from the start. Helena nodded, though the relief was tinged with anxiety. The meeting was set for later that week, and as the day approached, she grew quieter, retreating back into her thoughts, the weight of the past pressing heavily on her shoulders. On the day of the meeting, Leo walked with her to the small cafe where she would reunite with her friend. She hadn't asked him to come, but Leo insisted, sensing that she needed his presence as an anchor. They waited outside, her hands nervously twisting her scarf, her gaze darting around as if she might change her mind at any moment. But when her friend arrived, Helena froze, her eyes widening as they met the familiar face. The friend, a woman named Evelyn, who looked to be in her 40s with kind, steady eyes, approached her slowly, her expression a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. They stood in silence for a long moment, the years of separation hanging between them like a wall. Finally, Evelyn spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Helena, it's been a long time." There was no anger in her tone, only a gentle sadness, as though she, too, carried her share of grief. Helena struggled to find the words she had rehearsed so many times. "Evelyn, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For everything I did, for everyone I hurt. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to make amends. I want to make things right, if that's even possible." Her words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable, and Leo could see the pain etched into every line of her face. To her surprise, Evelyn reached out, placing a hand gently on her arm. "I won't lie, Helena. It took me a long time to understand why you did what you did," she said, her voice steady. "But I also know that everyone deserves a second chance. If you're willing to change, to truly make amends, then I believe in you." Her words were spoken softly, but they carried the weight of a long-forgotten friendship, a connection that hadn't been entirely broken. Helena's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, unable to speak. Leo watched, his heart swelling with pride as he witnessed the beginning of her redemption. For the first time, he felt the depth of the journey she was on, the courage it took for her to face those she had wronged. It was as if she were finally stepping out of the shadows, allowing herself to be seen, flaws and all. And though he didn't fully understand her past, he knew that this was a moment she would remember forever. The meeting was brief, but it held a significance that words couldn't capture. As they parted, Evelyn offered Helena a small smile, a silent promise of the possibility of rebuilding trust. Helena watched her walk away, a new sense of peace settling over her. She had taken the first step, and though there were still many bridges to rebuild, she knew now that it was possible, that she could find forgiveness, even if only in small doses. As they walked back to Helena's spot by the bakery, she looked at Leo, her face filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Leo," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "If it weren't for you, I never would have had the courage to do this." She reached down, hugging him tightly, her embrace filled with a warmth he hadn't felt from her before. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." Leo hugged her back, his small arms wrapped around her tightly. "You deserve it, Miss Helena," he said softly. "Everyone deserves a second chance." And as they stood there, wrapped in the warmth of their friendship, Helena felt something shift inside her, a lightness, a sense of release. The chains of her past had begun to loosen, and for the first time, she felt as though she were free to move forward. The journey was far from over, and there were still people she needed to face, wounds she needed to heal. But with Leo by her side, she felt stronger, more determined to continue. She was ready to confront the shadows of her past, one step at a time, until she could finally walk in the light without fear or regret. And as she looked down at Leo, she knew that he was the reason she had found the courage to begin this journey, a journey that would change her life forever. In the days following her reunion with Evelyn, Helena felt as though a weight had begun to lift from her shoulders, though the journey was far from over. She had taken a crucial first step, but there were still many people she had wronged, many whose lives had been affected by her past actions. And yet, for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Each small gesture, each attempt to make amends, was a piece of her penance, a way to slowly stitch together the fragments of the person she used to be. Leo, ever loyal, continued to accompany her on her journey, his innocent optimism lifting her spirits even on the hardest days. Together, they would talk about her plans for making things right, with Leo listening intently, his face thoughtful as he offered his own childlike insights. Sometimes, his words carried a wisdom that amazed her, a reminder that goodness and innocence had a strength all their own. It was a strength she had lost in her relentless pursuit of success, but one she was slowly rediscovering through his friendship. One crisp, cold morning, as they sat together in their usual spot by the bakery, Helena shared her next step. "There's one person I've been avoiding," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone who trusted me more than anyone else, and whom I hurt the most." Leo looked up, his gaze curious and concerned. He sensed that this was different, a deeper wound than the others she'd spoken of. "Who is it?" he asked softly, his voice filled with gentle encouragement. She hesitated, her gaze drifting to the street, as if the memories were too painful to confront head-on. "He was my business partner. My closest friend," she murmured. "We built everything together. But I was blinded by ambition, by the need to prove myself. I took risks he didn't agree with, and when everything fell apart, he was the one left picking up the pieces. I abandoned him when he needed me most." Leo listened, his heart aching for her. He could hear the regret in her voice, the guilt that weighed on her, and he could sense that this was the person she had hurt most deeply. "Have you tried reaching out to him?" he asked gently. She shook her head, her face shadowed by doubt. "I've wanted to, but I was afraid he would hate me, that he'd never want to see me again. He was the one person who truly believed in me, who saw the best in me when I couldn't see it in myself." Leo placed a reassuring hand on her arm, his small fingers warm against her cold skin. "Miss Helena, maybe he'll be hurt or angry, but I think he'd want to hear from you," he said with conviction. "Sometimes, people just need to know that you care, that you're sorry." His words, though simple, resonated deeply with her, a reminder that the only way to move forward was to face the past head-on, no matter how painful it might be. Bolstered by Leo's encouragement, Helena decided to reach out to her former partner. She wrote him a letter that night, pouring her heart into each word, trying to convey the depth of her regret and her desire to make amends. It took her hours, each sentence a struggle, as she fought to express the sorrow she had carried for so long. She hesitated before sending it, her hands shaking as she sealed the envelope, fearing that her words would fall on deaf ears. The days that followed were filled with anxiety and anticipation. Every time Leo met her at the bakery, he would ask if she'd heard anything, his young face filled with hope. But each time, Helena shook her head, her expression clouded by doubt. She tried to keep her spirits up, but the silence weighed on her, a reminder of the bridges she had burned, the people she had hurt. She feared that her former partner had indeed moved on, that he wanted nothing more to do with her. Then, one afternoon, as she sat in her usual spot with Leo by her side, her phone buzzed, a notification she hadn't expected. It was a message from her former partner, his words brief but open. "Helena, I received your letter. I wasn't expecting it, but perhaps it's time we talked. Meet me at the old office. She read the message aloud, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Leo's face lit up, his eyes shining with pride. See? I told you he'd want to hear from you. Helena's heart pounded as she prepared for the meeting. She hadn't set foot in the office since the day everything had crumbled, and the thought of returning filled her with a mix of fear and nostalgia. As she walked to the building, memories flooded her mind. Memories of long hours spent building the business, the laughter she'd shared with her partner, the dreams they'd nurtured together. She could still remember the day she walked away, leaving him to face the fallout alone. When she arrived, she found her former partner waiting for her in the lobby. He looked older, his hair streaked with gray, his face etched with lines that spoke of years of hardship. They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, he broke the silence. "Helena," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's been a long time." She nodded, struggling to find her voice. "I know, and I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. They walked through the building together, the echoes of the past following them with each step. As they reached the office where they had once shared their dreams, he turned to her, his gaze searching her face. "Why did you leave, Helena?" he asked, his voice filled with pain. "Why didn't you stay to face the consequences with me?" She took a deep breath, her heart heavy with guilt. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of facing the people I'd let down, of seeing the disappointment in your eyes." He listened, his expression softening as he absorbed her words. "You know, for years, I was angry with you," he said. "I thought you had abandoned me out of selfishness. But hearing you now, I realize you were just as lost as I was." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze filled with a quiet understanding. "Maybe it's time we both let go of the past. What's done is done, but that doesn't mean we can't build something new." Helena felt tears welling up, a profound sense of relief washing over her. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that redemption was possible, that she could find a way forward. As they stood together, she felt a flicker of hope, a fragile but undeniable sense of possibility. And as she left the office that evening, she knew that the journey wasn't over, but for the first time in years, she was walking toward a future she could finally face. Helena walked away from the office building with a feeling she hadn't experienced in years: lightness. Though her journey to forgiveness was far from complete, the conversation with her former partner had planted something fragile and new in her heart: hope. She could still feel the weight of her mistakes, but now, it was as though a glimmer of light shone through the cracks, illuminating a path forward. As she walked back to her usual spot by the bakery, her mind buzzed with the memory of her partner's words, his expression of understanding, and his willingness to rebuild something with her, even after all she had done. When she arrived, Leo was already waiting, bundled up against the chill. His eyes sparkled with anticipation, and he hurried to her side, his eager face searching hers. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice bubbling with excitement. She smiled down at him, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for this boy who had helped her take the first step toward redemption. "It went better than I ever expected," she replied softly, her voice filled with awe. "He listened, Leo. After everything, he listened and even forgave me, in his own way." Leo grinned, his face lighting up with pride. "I knew he would," he exclaimed, his enthusiasm contagious. "People don't just stop caring, Miss Helena. Sometimes they're just waiting for us to come back." His words, so simple yet so profound, struck a chord deep within her. She had been hiding for so long, assuming that she had burned all bridges, yet here was a second chance, a chance to mend what was broken, to try again, not as the woman she had once been, but as someone who had learned from her mistakes. Over the next few days, Helena continued reaching out, reconnecting with people from her past. Some were hesitant, their wounds still fresh, while others met her with cautious optimism, sensing the sincerity in her attempts to make amends. Each meeting was a step forward, a small victory on her journey of redemption. And through it all, Leo was there, cheering her on, offering her encouragement and strength with his unwavering belief in her. One afternoon, she decided to take a bold step, one she had been dreading since the beginning of her journey. There was one last person she needed to face, the person who had been the most loyal to her, even when she didn't deserve it. It was her younger sister, Emily, whom she had abandoned in her pursuit of success. Emily had been her closest confidant, the person who had believed in her even when others doubted. But when things had spiraled out of control, Helena had pushed her away, severing the one bond that had truly mattered. As she prepared to call Emily, her hands shook and her heart raced. She had spent years wondering if her sister hated her, if she would ever be able to forgive her for the pain she had caused. She dialed the number with trembling fingers, her mind racing with all the things she wanted to say, each word heavy with regret and longing. The phone rang, each tone echoing louder than the last, until finally, a familiar voice answered, hesitant yet unmistakable. "Hello." Emily's voice held a hint of apprehension, as though she sensed something significant on the other end of the line. Helena's throat tightened, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Emily, it's me, Helena," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause, and for a moment, Helena feared her sister would hang up. But then, she heard a faint sigh, a mixture of relief and sadness. "Helena," Emily replied softly, her voice filled with emotion. "It's been so long." The words hung between them, a reminder of the years they had lost, the silence that had grown between them. Helena struggled to find her voice, her heart aching as she remembered the bond they had once shared, a bond she had shattered in her quest for success. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm so sorry, Emily," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything. For leaving you behind, for pushing you away." There was a long silence on the other end, and Helena felt her heart sink, fearing that her sister would never be able to forgive her. But then, Emily's voice came through, soft and filled with an unmistakable warmth. "Helena, I've waited so long to hear you say that," she murmured. "I tried to reach out so many times, but I thought you'd moved on, that you didn't need me anymore." Her words were filled with a sorrow that mirrored Helena's own, a sorrow born from years of separation and longing. They spoke for hours, sharing stories, memories, and regrets, each word bringing them closer, slowly mending the rift that had divided them. For the first time in years, Helena felt a sense of belonging, a feeling she hadn't experienced since she had walked away from her family. Emily's forgiveness, her willingness to let go of the past, gave Helena a renewed sense of purpose, a feeling that perhaps, even after all she had done, she was worthy of love. When they finally said goodbye, Helena felt as though a piece of her soul had been restored. She had feared this conversation for so long, yet now, she felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet certainty that she was on the right path. As she met with Leo that evening, her heart was filled with gratitude, each step a reminder of the journey they had taken together, a journey that had brought her back to herself. Leo listened as she told him about her conversation with Emily, his face glowing with pride. "See, Miss Helena? You're not alone. People still care about you," he said, his words filled with the simplicity of truth. Helena nodded, her eyes misting with tears. "You're right, Leo. I spent so long believing I was beyond redemption, but you've shown me that there's always hope even when we feel lost." Together, they sat in silence, watching the streetlights flicker on as dusk settled over the town. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, Helena felt ready to face it, her heart lightened by the kindness of a young boy who had reminded her of what truly mattered. And as she looked at him, she realized that her journey wasn't just about making amends, it was about embracing the future, a future where she could finally be free of her past. The days had grown longer, and a gentle warmth began to thaw the streets, hinting at the arrival of spring. Each day, as the sun rose higher and brighter, it seemed to mirror the transformation within Helena. She had faced her past, extending her apologies, listening to the pain she had caused, and finding forgiveness she never thought possible. And through it all, Leo had been by her side, a steadfast, quiet source of strength. On a particularly crisp and sunny morning, Helena waited by the bakery, but this time it wasn't just to meet Leo. She held a letter in her hand, carefully written, addressed to the board of her old company. After weeks of searching, she had finally found a way to make tangible amends. She planned to reach out to those most affected by her past actions, offering both personal apologies and financial reparations. It wasn't an easy step, and it came with a heavy cost, but it was the final chapter of her redemption, a final act that allowed her to close the book on her past. As Leo arrived, he noticed the glow in her eyes, the weight that seemed to have lifted from her shoulders. "Miss Helena, you look different today," he said, his innocent observation filled with wonder. Helena smiled, feeling a deep affection for the boy who had changed her life. "That's because today is a special day," she replied, reaching into her bag and pulling out a small, beautifully wrapped box. She handed it to him, her eyes misting over as he carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a simple but elegant wristwatch, with a message engraved on the back, "To Leo, my light in the darkness. Thank you for showing me the way." Leo looked up, his eyes wide with surprise and gratitude. "Miss Helena, it's beautiful," he whispered, touched beyond words. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. "It's a small token, Leo. A reminder that you're the reason I found my way back." He hugged her tightly, and in that moment, Helena knew that this child, with his boundless kindness and faith, had given her something no wealth or status ever could, hope, and a reason to believe in herself again. She realized that the greatest riches she could ever have were the friendships and connections she had rebuilt, a newfound family who had welcomed her back despite the hurt she had caused. As they pulled away, Leo looked up at her, a spark of curiosity in his eyes. "So what's next for you, Miss Helena?" Helena smiled, feeling the anticipation of a future that she could now face with courage and clarity. "I've decided to take everything I've learned and start over. A fresh beginning, where I can build something honest, something good," she said, her voice filled with determination. She explained her plans to begin working with local charities, using her skills and resources to help those who had fallen through the cracks, people like she had once been. As the weeks went on, Helena's commitment to her new purpose grew. She poured her heart into every project, every new friendship, rebuilding her life from the ground up with integrity and humility. She worked quietly, avoiding the spotlight, but her efforts didn't go unnoticed. She earned a quiet reputation as a kind-hearted advocate, someone who understood the struggles of those she helped because she had lived them herself. Leo watched proudly, visiting her often as she continued to make amends and create a positive impact. Their friendship remained a constant, a bond that only grew stronger with each passing day. Helena began to consider him part of her family, a bond that was built not on blood, but on shared experiences, trust, and love. One evening, Helena received a call from her sister, Emily. She had been following Helena's progress, watching her transformation, and she wanted to meet to discuss the possibility of working together. They met at a small cafe, where they shared stories, laughter, and a renewed sense of trust. Helena poured out her gratitude, her voice breaking as she thanked her sister for giving her the chance to make things right. Through tears, Emily took her hand, and together they shared a moment of forgiveness and love, bridging the gap that had once separated them. "I'm proud of you, Helena," Emily whispered, her words filled with warmth. "You've become someone I always knew you could be." For the first time, Helena felt the completeness she had searched for all her life. She had found herself, not in wealth or success, but in the people who surrounded her, the people who believed in her despite her flaws. On a warm spring afternoon, Helena and Leo took a final walk through the neighborhood that had seen her transformation. She looked around, taking in the familiar streets, the bakery corner where they had shared countless conversations, the places that had become markers on her path to redemption. "It's funny," she mused, "I came here with nothing, feeling lost and ashamed. And now, it feels like home." Leo looked up at her, his eyes filled with warmth. "That's because you made it your home," he replied simply. "And everyone here knows it." They walked together in silence, enjoying the warmth of the sun, the sounds of laughter and life all around them. As they reached the corner, Helena knelt down to look at him, her gaze filled with love. "Thank you, Leo," she said softly. "You saved me, in more ways than you know." Leo smiled, his eyes filled with quiet wisdom. "Sometimes, we all just need someone to believe in us," he replied. And as they stood there, beneath the bright sky, Helena felt a deep peace settle over her, a peace that had eluded her for years, but that she had finally earned. As they parted ways that day, Helena knew that her journey was far from over. But now, she faced it with a sense of purpose and belonging, a future she could embrace with an open heart. And no matter where life took her, she would always carry the memory of this place, and of the boy who had guided her back to herself, her heart forever filled with gratitude for the second chance she had found in the most unlikely of places. If you like this story, take the opportunity to see the others that are appearing on your screen right now. Subscribe to the channel and comment on what you thought of this story. See you soon, bye.